The Georgia sun beat down on Fort Benning's shooting range like a hammer on an anvil. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb wiped the sweat from his brow, squinting through his scope at the distant target. Another miss. 3 inches high, 2 inches right. The mathematics were perfect on paper, but something was wrong. Beside him, Lieutenant Colonel Richardson shook his head with barely concealed frustration. This was the 5th consecutive training session where Webb's experimental trajectory calculations had failed to produce results. The other instructors whispered in the shade of the observation tower, their skepticism growing louder with each failed shot. Webb had been obsessing over what he called the barn plow angle for 8 months now. It started with a peculiar notation he'd found in his grandfather's war journal, a leather-bound book that smelled of tobacco and old paper. His grandfather, Thomas Webb, had served as a liaison officer with British forces in North Africa during World War II. Tucked between pages describing the heat of the desert and the chaos of tank battles was a crude diagram, barely more than scratched lines and numbers, with those 3 words scrawled at the top, barn plow angle. The diagram showed an unconventional bullet trajectory, one that defied standard ballistics training. Instead of the typical arc, it suggested a shallow, almost horizontal path that somehow accounted for wind, rotation, and target movement in a way Webb had never seen taught at any military institution. His grandfather had written beneath it, British sniper, Tobruk, 1942. Impossible shot. German officer, inside armored car. This works. For months, Webb had tried to reverse engineer the mathematics. He'd filled notebooks with calculations, spent his off-duty hours at the range, and endured the growing mockery of his peers. They'd started calling it Webb's ghost theory. Some joked he was chasing shadows left by a senile old man's imagination. Captain Jennifer Reeves approached from the equipment shed, her boots crunching on the gravel. She was the only one who hadn't completely written him off, though even her patience was wearing thin. She'd defended him in 3 separate review meetings, arguing that innovation required experimentation. But after today's failure, Webb could see doubt creeping into her eyes too. You're burning through ammunition and range time, Marcus. Richardson's voice carried across the firing line. The Army doesn't fund personal crusades. Either this theory produces results by next Friday, or we're reassigning you to basic marksmanship instruction. The threat hung in the air like cordite smoke. Basic marksmanship instruction was where careers went to die slowly, teaching fresh recruits how to hold a rifle while watching younger soldiers advance past you. Webb was 32, already older than most staff sergeants in sniper training. This demotion would effectively end any chance of advancement. That evening, Webb sat alone in his quarters, his grandfather's journal open on the desk. The base was quiet, most soldiers either at the mess hall or the rec center. He traced his finger over the faded diagram for the 1000th time, trying to see what he was missing. The angle measurements were there, the wind calculations, even notes about humidity and temperature. But something in the translation from paper to practice was failing. His phone buzzed. A text from his sister, Claire, back in their hometown of Marietta. She was cleaning out their late grandmother's house and had found more of their grandfather's belongings. Among them, she wrote, was an old metal ammunition case with papers inside. Most of it was routine military correspondence, but one envelope was marked with the same handwriting from the journal. Barn plow calculations, Captain H. Morrison, British 2nd Rifle Brigade. Webb's heart raced. Captain Morrison. A name. Someone who might have actually used this technique. He immediately called Claire, asking her to photograph every page and send them overnight. She promised to mail the originals and email scans within the hour. While he waited, Webb pulled up military archives online, searching for any record of Captain H. Morrison serving in North Africa. The databases were extensive but poorly organized, digitized records mixed with handwritten roster sheets that had been scanned years ago. After 2 hours of searching, he found it. Captain Harold Morrison, decorated marksman, served with distinction in the Siege of Tobruk, credited with multiple high-value eliminations including enemy officers. Died in 1987 in Sussex, England. The emails from Claire arrived at 2,300 hours. Webb opened the first attachment and his breath caught. These weren't just calculations. They were detailed instructions written in crisp military prose, explaining not just the mathematics but the philosophy behind the shot. Morrison had written, "Standard trajectories assume the shooter and target exist in isolation. They do not. Everything moves. The earth, the air, the target's vehicle, even the bullet's spin creates forces we typically ignore because they're small. But at extreme range, through narrow openings, these small forces become everything. The barn plow angle accounts for all of it." The next morning, Webb arrived at the range before dawn, Morrison's papers clutched in his hand. He'd spent the entire night recalculating everything, and suddenly the failures made sense. He'd been treating the angle as a fixed equation when it was actually a dynamic system that required real-time adjustment based on multiple environmental factors he'd been ignoring. Lieutenant Colonel Richardson was already waiting, arms crossed, his expression carved from granite. Behind him stood Major Patricia Kendrick from the Army Marksmanship Unit, flown in specifically to evaluate whether Webb's project deserved termination. Her reputation preceded her. She'd shut down 6 experimental programs in the past year alone, each one she deemed a waste of resources. "Sergeant Webb." Richardson's voice cut through the morning air. "Major Kendrick has graciously agreed to observe your final demonstration. You have exactly 3 attempts to prove this theory has merit. Otherwise, your transfer papers will be processed this afternoon." Webb nodded, his throat tight. He moved to the firing position, but Richardson raised his hand. "We're not using stationary targets today. If this barn plow angle is supposedly designed for moving targets behind cover, then that's what you'll hit." From behind the observation tower, a specialized training vehicle rolled onto the range. It was a modified armored truck with a small viewing port, exactly 8 inches wide. Inside sat a ballistic gel dummy representing a high-value target. The vehicle would drive at variable speeds across the 1,000-yard range while Webb had to thread a bullet through that narrow opening. Captain Reeves approached quietly. "Marcus, this is impossible. Even our best snipers can't make that shot consistently. They're setting you up to fail." Webb checked his rifle, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Maybe that's the point. Morrison made impossible shots. That's why nobody believed in this." The vehicle started moving, kicking up dust as it accelerated. Webb settled into position, but instead of immediately looking through his scope, he closed his eyes. Morrison's words echoed in his memory. "Feel the wind direction, the Earth's rotation, the target's rhythm. Mathematics can only take you so far. The rest is instinct built on understanding." He opened his eyes and began his calculations, but this time incorporating every variable Morrison had outlined. Wind speed at 3 different altitudes between him and target. The Coriolis effect at this latitude. The vehicle's acceleration pattern. The slight downward angle of the terrain. First shot. He squeezed the trigger. The bullet cracked through the air and struck the armored plating 2 inches left of the port. A miss that would have been impressive at this range and difficulty, but still a failure. Major Kendrick made a note on her tablet, her face expressionless. Second shot. Webb adjusted, recalculating the lead time. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. This time the bullet sparked off the right edge of the viewing port frame. Closer, but still wrong. "You have 1 shot left, Sergeant." Richardson's voice held no sympathy. Webb exhaled slowly, his finger resting beside the trigger guard. The vehicle continued its pattern across the range, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. He looked at Morrison's diagram one more time, spread on the shooting mat beside him. Then he saw it, the detail he'd overlooked every single time. Morrison hadn't just calculated for the bullet's path. He'd calculated for the deflection caused by the vehicle's own metal frame creating azimuthal magnetic interference with the copper jacket. It was infinitesimal, barely worth mentioning in standard shooting, but at 1,000 yards through an 8-inch gap, it was everything. Webb made one final adjustment to his scope, but more importantly, he shifted his aim point 3 degrees left of where logic said it should be. He was now aiming at what appeared to be solid armor plating, trusting Morrison's 70-year-old mathematics to bend physics in his favor. Captain Reeves held her breath beside him. The other instructors had gone silent, watching this final attempt with a mixture of curiosity and schadenfreude. Major Kendrick's pen hovered over her tablet, ready to write the final condemnation. Webb felt the wind shift slightly, adjusted one more time, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle echoed across Fort Benning. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the vehicle's emergency lights flashed red. The drill came to an immediate halt. The range officer's voice crackled over the radio. Direct hit. Target eliminated. Requesting verification. Richardson's jaw dropped. Major Kendrick actually stood up from her chair, lowering her tablet. Captain Reeves grabbed Webb's shoulder, her eyes wide with disbelief. Two range officers jogged to the vehicle and opened the rear door. They pulled out the ballistic gel dummy, and even from a distance, Webb could see the dark channel where his bullet had entered through the viewing port and struck center mass exactly where a human heart would be. The silence on the observation deck was deafening. Then, slowly, Major Kendrick began walking down toward the firing line. Her expression was unreadable, but her pace was deliberate. Webb stood at attention, his rifle still warm in his hands. Sergeant Webb. Her voice was measured, professional. In my 15 years evaluating military programs, I have never seen a shot like that. Explain to me in detail what you just did. If you're watching this and thinking that persistence pays off, take a moment and subscribe to this channel. Because what happens next with the barn plow angle is going to change modern military sniping forever, and you won't want to miss it. Webb began explaining Morrison's calculations, showing her the papers, the journal entries, the mathematics that accounted for variables nobody else considered. As he spoke, he watched Major Kendrick's skepticism transform into something else entirely. Recognition that she was witnessing the resurrection of a lost art. Richardson approached, his earlier hostility replaced by cautious respect. Can you replicate that shot, Sergeant? Webb looked at the target range, then back at Morrison's papers. Give me 2 more attempts, sir. I'll prove this wasn't luck. Over the next 6 weeks, Fort Benning transformed into something Webb had never imagined. Major Kendrick didn't just approve his project. She expanded it. The barn plow angle program received full funding, a dedicated research team, and access to military archives across 3 continents. Webb went from facing termination to leading the Army's most innovative marksmanship initiative. But success brought new pressure. Word spread quickly through military channels, and with it came skeptics far more powerful than Lieutenant Colonel Richardson. A contingent of senior officers from the Pentagon arrived unannounced one October morning, demanding a live demonstration. Among them was Brigadier General Robert Vance, a man whose career was built on conventional tactics and who viewed experimental programs as distractions from real warfare. Webb stood before them in the briefing room, Morrison's original journal displayed on the projector screen. He explained the physics, the history, the 9 successful replications he'd achieved in controlled conditions. But Vance interrupted him with a dismissive wave. Sergeant, I don't care about your grandfather's war stories or some British sniper's lucky shot from 1942. What I care about is whether this technique has any practical application in modern combat. These fancy calculations mean nothing if they can't be taught to our soldiers in the field. Captain Reeves, now officially assigned as Webb's second-in-command, stepped forward. Sir, we've already begun preliminary training with 6 volunteer snipers. 4 of them achieved successful shots within 2 weeks. Vance leaned back in his chair, his expression unchanged. Then let's make this interesting. I want a real-world scenario. No controlled range conditions. No predetermined targets. We simulate an actual combat extraction where a high-value target needs to be eliminated from inside a moving vehicle in an urban environment with civilians present. If your barn plow angle can handle that complexity, then maybe it's worth the Army's continued investment. The challenge was set for 72 hours later. Webb's team worked around the clock, building a mock urban scenario in Fort Benning's advanced training sector. They programmed multiple civilian vehicles into the pattern, added wind machines to create unpredictable gusts between buildings, and placed the target vehicle on a route with 13 turns and varying speeds. The night before the demonstration, Webb couldn't sleep. He sat in his quarters reviewing Morrison's papers for what must have been the 1000th time. His phone rang. It was an unknown international number. Hello? Webb answered cautiously. A British accent came through, elderly but sharp. "Staff Sergeant Webb? My name is James Morrison. Captain Harold Morrison was my father. I understand you've been studying his work." Webb's heart nearly stopped. For the next hour, James Morrison told him stories his father had shared before his death. The barn plow angle wasn't just mathematics. It was developed during the desperate siege of Tobruk when British forces were outnumbered and outgunned. His father had been forced to innovate or watch his men die. The technique was born from necessity, refined through dozens of impossible shots that saved lives. "There's something my father never wrote down," James said quietly. "He told me the angle only works if you trust it completely. Hesitation, even for a microsecond, throws off the rhythm. You must commit entirely." The morning of the demonstration arrived with an unseasonable chill. Webb stood at the designated firing position on a rooftop overlooking the mock urban environment. Below, the training scenario buzzed with activity. 5 civilian vehicles moved through the streets alongside the target vehicle. An armored SUV with tinted windows and a driver trained in evasive maneuvers. Inside sat a high-value target dummy equipped with sensors that would register any hit. Brigadier General Vance watched from the command center, surrounded by observers from the Pentagon, CIA, and even 2 NATO representatives who'd flown in specifically for this evaluation. The stakes had grown beyond anything Webb anticipated. This wasn't just about validating his grandfather's legacy anymore. It was about changing how modern militaries approached precision engagement. Captain Reeves established communication through his earpiece. Target vehicle entering the zone in 30 seconds. Wind speeds variable between 8 and 15 miles per hour. Multiple obstructions. You have one shot, Marcus. Make it count. Webb settled into position, his rifle an extension of his body. He watched the vehicles move through the street below, calculating, adjusting, feeling the rhythm James Morrison had described. The target vehicle wove between civilian cars, accelerated through intersections, used buildings as cover. It was designed to be an impossible shot. Then Webb saw his moment. A 3-second window where the vehicle would pass through an alley intersection. The viewing port would be exposed for less than 2 seconds, partially obscured by a civilian sedan in the foreground. The angle required threading the bullet between 2 buildings, accounting for crosswind that would shift twice during the bullet's flight path, and leading the target by nearly 6 feet to compensate for its speed. He stopped calculating and started feeling. Morrison's words echoed. "Trust it completely." Webb squeezed the trigger. The bullet left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. It traveled through the variable wind, its trajectory adjusted by forces most shooters never considered. It passed within inches of the civilian sedan, threaded through the narrow alley gap, and struck through the armored SUV's viewing port exactly as the vehicle reached the intersection's center point. The target vehicle's emergency lights activated immediately. The simulation ended. For 5 seconds, nobody in the command center spoke. Then the range officer's voice came through every radio. Confirmed hit. Center mass. Target eliminated. 0 civilian casualties. General Vance stood slowly from his chair, his expression transformed. He walked to the observation window, looking toward the rooftop where Webb remained in position. Then he picked up the communication handset. "Sergeant Webb, this is General Vance. In 33 years of military service, I have never been so pleased to be proven wrong. The barn plow angle program is hereby approved for full integration into Army sniper training. You've just revolutionized modern marksmanship." Webb closed his eyes, overwhelmed. Captain Reeves was suddenly beside him, tears streaming down her face as she pulled him into an embrace. Below, the training ground erupted in cheers from soldiers who'd been watching on monitors. That evening, Webb opened his grandfather's journal one final time. On the last page, Thomas Webb had written something he'd never noticed before. "Some knowledge waits generations to find the right person. I pray someone worthy finds this. You did well, grandson." 3 years later, Webb stood in the National Museum of Military History in Washington, D.C., adjusting his dress uniform one final time. The exhibition hall was packed with military personnel, historians, and journalists from around the world. At the center of the room, displayed under museum-grade lighting, sat his grandfather's worn leather journal alongside Captain Harold Morrison's original calculations and the very rifle Webb had used for that historic demonstration at Fort Benning. The exhibition was titled, "The Barn Plow Angle Rediscovered Precision in Modern Warfare." Master Sergeant Marcus Webb now led the Army's Advanced Marksmanship Innovation Division, a program that had trained over 200 snipers in Morrison's technique. The barn plow angle had been successfully employed in 4 real combat operations, saving lives and accomplishing missions previously deemed impossible. Webb had received the Legion of Merit, been promoted twice, and co-authored a training manual that was now standard issue across NATO forces. Captain Reeves, now Major Reeves, stood beside him as his deputy director. Together they'd expanded the research, discovering that Morrison's principles applied beyond sniping to artillery calculations, drone strikes, and even naval gunnery. The old British captain's innovation from the deserts of Tobruk had become the foundation for 21st-century precision warfare. James Morrison had flown in from Sussex for the exhibition opening. The 83-year-old man walked slowly but with dignity, accompanied by his own grandson, a lieutenant in the British Army who'd recently completed barn plow training himself. When James saw his father's papers displayed with such honor, he wept openly. "My father died thinking his greatest work would be forgotten," James said quietly to Webb. "He never knew it would save lives decades after his death. Thank you for refusing to let it disappear." General Vance, now overseeing all special operations training, approached the small group. He'd become one of the program's strongest advocates. His initial skepticism transformed into passionate support. "Sergeant Webb, or should I say Master Sergeant, I've just received word from the Secretary of Defense. The barn plow angle program is being expanded to all branches of the military, including specialized training for Secret Service and FBI tactical units." Webb looked at the exhibition, at his grandfather's journal that had started everything, and felt a profound sense of completion. Thomas Webb had carried that knowledge across an ocean and through decades, trusting that someday, someone would understand its value. Captain Morrison had risked his reputation developing techniques others called impossible. Both men had believed in innovation when the world demanded conformity. As the ceremony concluded and guests mingled around the exhibits, Webb noticed a young Army private staring intently at Morrison's original diagram, taking photos with her phone, that same look of fascination Webb remembered feeling 3 years ago. He approached her with a smile. "See something interesting, Private?" She looked up, startled, then recognized him. "Sir, I think there's more here. Look at these secondary calculations in the margin. I think Captain Morrison was working on something even more advanced."